They say that a ship is safe in harbour, but that is not what ships are built for. In 1941, the British Empire placed its faith in a single vessel. She was called the Mighty Hood. She was 42,000 tons of diplomatic immunity, a steel cathedral that promised the world that Britannia still ruled the waves. She was the most famous ship on Earth, and she was never supposed to die. But fame is not armour, and mythology stops at the waterline. On a grey morning in the Denmark Strait, the pride of a nation was erased in just 180 seconds. She wasn't destroyed by an overwhelming fleet, but by a single terrifying flaw that everyone knew about, but no one dared to fix. 1,418 men went into the water. Only 3 came out. This is the story of one of them. It is the story of a 19-year-old boy who swam through burning oil and lived to carry the ghosts of his friends for the rest of his life. It is a story about the lies we tell ourselves to feel safe and the terrible price of waking up. So turn down the lights, settle into your chair. Join me as we peel back the layers of propaganda and rust to reveal the human tragedy beneath the steel. This is the story of the fire, the ice, and the fall of the Mighty Hood. The North Atlantic is not a place where human beings belong. It is a vast, grey wilderness, a desert of water that behaves with a violence that feels personal. In May, the wind does not just blow, it bites. It carries the chill of the Arctic ice shelf, a penetrating cold that finds its way through heavy wool coats, through layers of flannel, through leather gloves, and settles deep in the marrow of the bone. The sea here is not blue. It is the color of slate, or sometimes the color of a bruise. It heaves in long, rolling swells that can hide a building or a ship or a tragedy. On the morning of May 24, 1941, this grey wilderness was the stage for a collision between the past and the future. 2 distinct eras of warfare were sailing toward one another through the mist. On one side, the cutting edge of a terrifying new totalitarian efficiency. On the other, the fading, majestic and desperate pride of an empire that was slowly bleeding out. If you had been standing on the deck of the British ship that morning, you would have felt the vibration of the turbines coming up through the steel plates of the deck, buzzing against the soles of your boots. You would have smelled the heavy, sulphurous stench of funnel smoke, thick and oily, mixing with the salt spray. You would have seen the horizon, blurred by snow squalls and fog banks, a curtain that was about to be pulled back. But mostly you would have felt the confidence. It was a tangible thing, as heavy as the armor plating. The men on board this ship did not believe they could lose. They were sailing on the HMS Hood. And to a British sailor in 1941, the Hood was not just a machine, it was a religion. It was 42,000 tons of mythology, hammered into the shape of a hull. She was the Mighty Hood. For 20 years, she had been the largest warship in the world. She was the visible, floating proof that Britannia still ruled the waves. To understand the horror of what happened next, you have to understand the seduction of that size. The sheer scale of her. She was 860 feet long. If you stood her on end, she would tower over the skyscrapers of London. She carried 8 15-inch guns, weapons capable of hurling a car-sized shell over 17 miles. She was beautiful, too. In an age of ugly utilitarian dreadnoughts, the Hood had the lines of a racing yacht, stretched out to gigantism. She was sleek, low in the water, built for speed and grace. She was the diplomatic celebrity of the Royal Navy. She had toured the world. Kings and queens had walked her teak decks. Children had built models of her in schoolrooms from New Zealand to Newfoundland. She was the avatar of safety. But there is a difference between a symbol and a weapon. A symbol is maintained by belief. A weapon is maintained by engineering. And deep inside the Admiralty, in the quiet, smoke-filled rooms where the blueprints were kept, the men with the slide rules knew the truth. They knew that the Mighty Hood was a glass cannon. She was built during the First World War, designed before the lessons of modern gunnery had truly been learned. She was a battle cruiser, not a battleship. The distinction is subtle but fatal. The philosophy behind her design was simple. Speed is armor. The idea was that she could outrun anything she couldn't outgun. Because of this, she stripped weight to gain knots, and she stripped that weight from her deck armor. The steel protecting her horizontal surfaces, the roofs of her turrets, the decks over her magazines, was terrifyingly thin. It was meant to stop shells fired from close range, shells that hit the side of the ship. But naval warfare had changed. Guns had gotten bigger. Fire control had gotten better. Battles were now fought at extreme distances, and at extreme distances, shells do not fly in a flat line. They arc. They climb high into the stratosphere and plunge down like meteors. Against plunging fire, the Hood was naked. The officers knew this. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, the man commanding the squadron that day, knew it better than anyone. He carried the knowledge of that vulnerability like a stone in his stomach. He knew that if he let an enemy ship get the range, if he let them lob shells down onto his decks, the Hood would not survive. His only chance, his only tactical option was to close the distance. He had to rush the enemy. He had to get in close, where the trajectory of the incoming shells would be flat, hitting the thick belt armor on the ship's side, rather than the thin plating on her deck. He had to sprint into the teeth of the guns, but the men didn't know. The 2,000 souls sleeping in hammocks, peeling potatoes in the galley, checking pressure gauges in the boiler rooms. They believed the myth. They looked at the massive turrets and felt safe. They touched the steel walls and felt invincible. Among them was a boy named Ted Briggs. Ted Briggs was 19 years old. In the grand calculus of war, he was a rounding error, a speck. He had reported for duty with the wide eyes of a teenager who had won a lottery. To be assigned to the Hood was the dream of every young sailor. It was the elite posting. When he first walked up the gangplank dragging his kit bag, looking up at the towering superstructure, he felt like he had been accepted into a secret society of giants. Briggs was a signalman. His war was not fought in the dark, sweating heat of the engine room, nor inside the deafening echo chamber of a gun turret. His war was fought in the open air. His station was on the compass platform, high up in the ship's superstructure, exposed to the wind and the spray. His job was communication, flags, lamps, codes. Picture him there. A 19-year-old boy, wrapped in a duffel coat that is slightly too big, his fingers red and stiff from the cold. He stands on the metal grating of the bridge, surrounded by officers twice his age. He is the eyes and ears of the fleet. He watches the halyards, the ropes that hoist the colorful geometric flags that allow ships to talk without breaking radio silence. It is a mundane job in many ways. It is a job of routine. Check the flag locker. Ensure the lines are free of ice. Polish the signal lamp. Stand watch. Stare at the grey horizon until your eyes water. But because of this job, because of this specific station, Ted Briggs was placed in the one location on the ship that would offer him a ticket to survival and a front-row seat to hell. He was proud. That is the emotion that dominates the letters and diaries of the men on the Hood. Not fear, not yet. Pride. Briggs felt the history of the ship seeping into him. He knew that 20 years earlier, this ship had circumnavigated the globe on the Empire cruise, visited by millions of people. She was the star, and now she was hunting. But the Hood was tired. That was the other secret, hidden beneath the fresh coats of grey paint. She was an old ship, and she had been ridden hard. For 2 years of war she had been patrolling, chasing ghosts, steaming at high speed through rough seas. Her condensers were leaking. Her water distillers were failing. She sat low in the water, weighed down by the additions of new radar equipment and anti-aircraft guns that her hull was never designed to carry. She groaned in heavy seas. The steel plates would flex and creak, a constant low-frequency complaint that became the background noise of life on board. The Admiralty had scheduled her for a major overhaul, a great refit, to strip her down and rebuild her, to add the deck armor she so desperately needed. But the war would not allow it. Every time she was scheduled to go into dry dock, a crisis would emerge. The Italians in the Mediterranean, the threat of invasion, the convoys needing escort. And so, the repairs were cancelled. The beast was told to keep running. The cracks were painted over. The mighty Hood was sent back out, an exhausted prizefighter forced into the ring one too many times. And now she was sailing north to the Denmark Strait. The intelligence reports had come in a flurry of panicked signals. The Bismarck had put to sea. The German battleship, the pride of Hitler's navy, had left her berth in occupied Poland and was making a break for the Atlantic. The Bismarck was everything the Hood was not. She was brand new. She was wider, more stable. Her internal compartmentalization was a marvel of engineering. making her almost impossible to sink. Her guns were modern, with fire control systems that used analog computers to calculate firing solutions in seconds. And most importantly, her armor was thick, distributed in a way that protected her vitals from almost any angle. She was a machine built for the specific purpose of killing ships like the Hood. The strategic situation was a nightmare for the British. If the Bismarck broke out into the open Atlantic, she would disappear into the vastness of the ocean. She would become a wolf among the sheep, hunting the merchant convoys that were the only lifeline keeping Britain alive. She could starve the island nation into submission in months. She had to be stopped before she reached the open sea. So the trap was set. The Royal Navy mobilized everything: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers. They cast a net across the North Sea, and the Hood, accompanied by the brand new battleship Prince of Wales, was the heavy hammer sent to guard the Denmark Strait, the narrow slice of water between Iceland and Greenland. The geography of the Denmark Strait adds a layer of claustrophobia to the story. It sounds wide on a map, but in reality it is a choke point. To the north, the pack ice descends from the Arctic, a solid white wall that pushes ships southward. To the south, the rocky, mine-laden coast of Iceland. The navigable channel is narrowed, forcing ships into a corridor. It is a funnel, and it is famous for its foul weather. On the night of May 23rd, the weather was running true to form. Snow flurries whipped across the decks. The sun set, but in these high latitudes, the darkness was never total. It was a twilight grey, a spectral half-light that played tricks on the eyes. Ted Briggs stood his watch. He stamped his feet to keep the blood moving. He watched the signal flags of the Prince of Wales sailing alongside them. The Prince of Wales was a new ship, still having her teething troubles. Civilian contractors were actually still on board, working on her guns while she sailed to battle. The contrast was stark: the old exhausted legend and the broken-in, unready novice. The tension on the bridge was brittle. Admiral Holland stood in his greatcoat, peering through binoculars. He was a small man, precise, quiet. He was a gunnery expert. He was running calculations in his head. He knew that the German ships were equipped with radar. He knew they might be spotted long before they could see the enemy. He knew he had to cross the T, to bring all his guns to bear, while the enemy could only fire their forward turrets. But the weather was not cooperating. The visibility was patchy. Mist patches would swallow the horizon and then spit it back out. Around 19:00 hours, the signal came. The heavy cruisers patrolling the ice edge, the Norfolk and the Suffolk, had made contact. They had spotted the Bismarck and her escort, the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. They were shadowing them, slipping in and out of the fog banks, sending location reports. The hunt was on. On the mess decks of the Hood, the loudspeaker clicked. The bosun's pipe shrilled, that high, piercing whistle that cuts through the rumble of the engines. Action stations! Action stations! Assume first degree of readiness. The change in the ship was instant. The casual atmosphere of the cruise evaporated. Men dropped their playing cards. They abandoned half-finished cups of tea, Kai. They ran to their lockers, grabbing anti-flash gear, white hoods and gloves made of fire-resistant cotton that made them look like monks or ghosts. They moved with the practiced efficiency of a machine. Down in the magazines, deep below the waterline, the doors were sealed. These men were now locked in a steel tomb. Their job was to hoist the massive shells and the cordite propellant charges up to the guns. They would not see the battle. They would not see the ocean. They would only see the painted steel walls, the brass levers, and the hydraulic lifts. They were dependent entirely on the voice pipes and the telephones. They were the muscle of the ship, blind and buried. Up on the bridge, the silence deepened. The wireless was kept quiet to avoid detection. The only sounds were the wind, the crash of the bow breaking the waves, and the terse commands of the officers. Admiral Holland made a fateful decision. He ordered the ships to turn. He wanted to intercept the Bismarck at dawn. He wanted the rising sun behind him, silhouetting the German ships while leaving the Hood in the shadows. It was a classic tactic, but the sea is a chaotic variable. The Bismarck made a slight course alteration in the night, a juke to the west. The cruisers lost contact in a snow squall. For hours, the Hood was blind, rushing through the dark, searching for an enemy that had vanished. Imagine the psychological strain. Thousands of men wide awake, adrenaline pumping, waiting for a crash that doesn't come. The adrenaline fades, replaced by a jittery exhaustion. The cold seeps back in. Then, just before 0300, the Suffolk regained contact. The Bismarck was there. But the geometry had changed. The angle was wrong. The sun would not be behind the British. The element of surprise was gone. And worse, the distance. The course correction meant that the Hood would approach the Bismarck from an angle that exposed her to fire for longer than Holland had planned. He would have to charge across a wide stretch of open ocean, under the guns of the enemy, before he could get close enough to be safe. Ted Briggs watched the sky begin to lighten. It was May 24th, Empire Day. A holiday meant to celebrate the global reach of the British Dominion. The irony was likely lost on him in the freezing wind. The dawn was not a burst of golden light. It was a slow lifting of the gloom. The sea turned from black to a hard metallic grey. The visibility improved, which was the worst thing that could happen. The fog banks that might have shielded their approach were lifting. At 05:37, the lookout shouted, "Smoke-bearing green 40. It was a smudge on the horizon 17 miles away. The tops of the masts appeared first, then the superstructures, identifying themselves against the pale sky. Two ships, the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen. On the bridge of the Hood, the order was given. "Pilot, alter course to 300. The great ship banked, heeling over as the rudder bit into the water. She turned her bow directly toward the enemy. The Prince of Wales followed suit. This was the charge. Admiral Holland's plan was desperate but necessary. He ordered full speed. The engine room telegraphs rang. The stokers down in the boiler rooms turned the valves, pumping oil into the furnaces. The ship began to shudder as she pushed past 28 knots. The bow wave rose up, a wall of white water crashing over the foredeck. Briggs stood at the signal halyards, waiting. His job was to hoist the battle ensigns, the massive Union Jacks that would fly from the mastheads. It was an act of chivalry, a tradition from the age of sail. You do not fight under a false flag. You announce yourself. "Hoist the battle ensigns," the captain ordered. Briggs clipped the heavy flags to the lines. He pulled the ropes. The wind caught the fabric, snapping it open with a sound like a gunshot. The colors were brilliant against the grey sky, red, white, and blue. At 05:52, the range was 25,000 yards, 12.5 miles. "Open fire!" The order was spoken calmly. It was relayed to the gunnery control tower. The fire control table, a mechanical computer of gears and cogs, locked in the solution. The forward turrets of the Hood rotated. The massive barrels elevated. And then the world ended. The sound of 15-inch guns firing is not a noise you hear. It is a pressure you feel. It compresses the air in your lungs. It rattles your teeth. A sheet of orange flame hundreds of feet long erupted from the barrels. The ship actually halted in the water for a fraction of a second from the recoil. 4 shells, each weighing nearly a ton, screamed into the sky, traveling at twice the speed of sound. Ted Briggs watched them go. He watched the brown cordite smoke drift back over the bridge, stinging his eyes. He counted the seconds. Flight time at this range was nearly a minute of silence, a minute of waiting to see if the first punch had landed. But across the water on the horizon, tiny flashes of light sparkled. The Germans had fired back. The duel had begun, and the Hood was charging straight into a trap of physics and geometry that had been waiting for her since the day she was launched. The doctrine of speed was about to collide with the reality of high-explosive, armor-piercing steel. The shells were in the air. The narrative pauses here. We are suspended in that minute of flight time. The shells are at the apex of their trajectory, miles high in the freezing atmosphere. Below them, the Hood is tearing through the water, her bow burying itself in the waves, her crew screaming in the turrets as they reload. To understand what happens when those shells land, we have to go inside the machine. We have to leave the cold air of the bridge and descend into the steel cathedral of the ship itself. We have to understand the fragility of the magazine, the volatility of the cordite, and the terrifying sequence of events that is about to unfold in the dark. The mighty Hood has 3 minutes left to live. This is the end of the rise. The fall is coming. deep inside the hull of the Hood. The war was not a visual experience. It was a rhythm. In the 4-inch magazines and the shell handling rooms, men stripped to the waist worked in a humid, recycled haze. They were part of a mechanical loop. A bell would ring, a hoist would rattle down, a shell, heavy and cold, would be clamped in. A lever pulled, the hoist would rattle up. They did not know that the Bismarck was 17 miles away. They did not know the sun was shining weakly through the clouds. They knew only the smell of hydraulic fluid and the vibration of the screws driving the ship at 30 knots. They were the heartbeat of the creature, pumping blood to the iron fists above. They trusted the armor plating around them. They trusted the legacy. They were encased in the safest place in the British Empire. Above them, the first salvo from the Hood landed. It was a miss. The fountains of water erupted harmlessly into the sea, hundreds of yards from the German ships. The range was slightly off. The wind had carried the shells astray. But the Germans did not miss. The Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen had been training for this moment, with a robotic intensity. Their optical rangefinders were stereoscopic marvels. They tracked the Hood's mastheads. They calculated the speed. They calculated the wind. The first German shells arrived with a sound like tearing canvas. They screamed overhead, a high-pitched shriek that terrified even veteran sailors. They splashed into the water around the Hood and the Prince of Wales, sending geysers of dirty water high above the mastheads. But one shell from the Prinz Eugen found its mark. It didn't strike the thick armor belt. It struck amidships near the mainmast, hitting a locker on the boat deck. This locker didn't contain vital machinery. It contained ready-use ammunition for the anti-aircraft rockets, unprotected explosives. A fire erupted instantly. It was a fierce, bright blaze, burning with the intensity of a chemical flare. On the grey canvas of the ocean, the Hood was no longer just a target. She was a beacon. The fire lit up her silhouette, providing the German gunners with a perfect point of aim. On the bridge, Ted Briggs watched the fire. He could feel the heat of it on the back of his neck. The smoke began to curl around the superstructure, acrid and choking. The officers on the compass platform were shouting orders to the damage control parties, but there was a strange lack of panic. Fire was a problem, yes, but fire could be fought. The ship was huge. A fire on the boat deck was like a cut on a giant's finger. Annoying but not fatal, Admiral Holland remained calm. He ordered a turn to port. He was trying to bring the aft turrets to bear, to unleash the full firepower of the Hood. He was trying to close the distance, to get out of the danger zone where the shells fell vertically. He was racing the clock. He needed 2 more minutes. Just 2 minutes to close the range. The Bismarck fired again. It is 6-0. The 5th salvo leaves the barrels of the German battleship. 4 15-inch shells, each one an armor-piercing hammer, arc into the stratosphere. They reach the apex of their flight, suspended in the cold air, and then they begin their descent. They do not come in sideways. They come in at a steep angle, plunging down from the sky. One of them misses. 2 of them splash into the sea. The 4th shell strikes the Hood. It hits between the mainmast and the rear funnel. It slices through the thin steel of the upper deck as if it were paper. It punches through the next deck and the next. It travels deep into the bowels of the ship, passing through the mess decks where breakfast is still set out, passing through the sleeping quarters, boring down toward the keel. It penetrates the 4-inch magazine. The explosion that followed is difficult to describe in the language of human violence. It belongs to the language of planetary geology. The shell detonated the ready-use ammunition, but the shockwave didn't stop there. It flashed through the bulkheads, finding the main magazine, the room holding over 100 tons of cordite propellant for the massive 15-inch guns. Cordite is unstable. It burns with a ferocity that defies physics. When 100 tons of it ignites in a confined space, it does not just burn, it expands. The Hood did not simply blow up. She was erased from the inside out. Ted Briggs, standing on the bridge, did not hear a bang. The human ear cannot process a sound of that magnitude. It simply registers as a pressure wave, a silence so loud it wipes out all other senses. What he felt was the ship dying beneath him. The Hood stopped. A 42,000-ton vessel, moving at 30 knots, was arrested in the water as if she had hit a granite wall. The entire ship whipped violently, throwing men off their feet. Then came the heat. A column of flame 1,000 feet high erupted from the center of the ship. It was not orange. It was white, changing to a sickly purple at the edges. It shot into the sky, carrying with it debris, steel plates, boats, and the bodies of men. It turned the gray morning into a blinding, hellish noon. On the bridge, the blast waves swept over them. Briggs was thrown forward. Glass shattered. The heavy brass compass stand was sheared off its bolts. He scrambled to his feet, dazed. He looked aft, towards the rear of the ship. The rear of the ship was gone. Where the aft turrets had been, where the quarterdeck had been, there was only smoke and a twisted, jagged edge of metal. The ship had broken her back. She had snapped in two. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of shock. The engines were dead, the guns were silent. The only sound was the roaring of the fire and the groaning of tortured steel. The bow of the ship, the section where Briggs and the Admiral stood, began to tilt. It wasn't a slow list, it was a lurch. The severed front half of the hood, no longer held up by the buoyancy of the stern, began to slide backward into the sea. Admiral Holland was sitting in his chair. He did not move, he did not scream. He looked at the devastation, at the ruin of his command, and he slumped. He knew, with the cold clarity of a mathematician, that the equation was finished. "Leave the bridge," the squadron navigator said. It wasn't a scream. It was a quiet suggestion. Briggs moved to the door. The angle of the deck was already 20 degrees. Walking was impossible. He had to climb the floor. He looked back one last time. The Admiral was still sitting there, staring out at the horizon, making no attempt to save himself. He was going down with his vessel, a statue of duty frozen in time. Briggs scrambled out onto the open deck. The scene was apocalyptic. The sea was rushing up to meet him. The water wasn't rising, the ship was falling. The ocean poured over the railings, swirling around the superstructure. There was no time for lifeboats. There was no time for rafts. There was no time for prayers. The Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, the most famous ship in the world, took 3 minutes to die. 3 minutes from the explosion to the moment the waves closed over the top of the mast. Briggs climbed higher, trying to get away from the water. He scrambled up the ladder to the Admiral's bridge, then higher to the spotting top, but the water was faster. It chased him up the steel. He felt the cold shock of the Atlantic hit his legs, then his waist. The buoyancy of his duffel coat fought him for a second, trying to float, but the suction of the sinking ship was a giant, invisible hand grabbing his ankles. He took a breath, a single desperate gulp of air mixed with smoke, and then he was pulled under. The darkness was total. The cold was a physical blow, a sledgehammer to the chest. Briggs was dragged down, tumbling in the vortex created by 40,000 tons of steel plummeting to the bottom of the ocean. The pressure built instantly. His ears popped. His lungs screamed for oxygen. He was spinning, disoriented, a piece of debris caught in a drain. He knew he was dead. He accepted it. There was no fighting this. The ship was taking him to the bottom. And then, the physics of the disaster offered a final, cruel twist. As the ship rolled over and sank, trapped air pockets inside the hull exploded outward. A massive bubble of air burst from the control tower. It hit Briggs like a geyser. It arrested his descent and shot him upward. He was a cork in a champagne bottle. He flew up through the black water, his speed unchecked. He broke the surface. He gasped, choking on seawater and oil. He flailed his arms trying to stay afloat. He wiped the slime from his eyes and looked around. The world had changed color. The sea was no longer gray. It was black and red. Millions of gallons of fuel oil had ruptured from the Hood's bunkers. It formed a thick, viscous blanket over the waves, smoothing out the chop, and in places it was burning. Patches of fire danced on the water, feeding on the fuel. Briggs was swimming in oil. It coated his face, his hands, his eyes. It tasted of sulfur and death. It weighed down his clothes, pulling him back under. He trod water, turning in a circle, looking for the ship. But the ship was gone. The only thing remaining was the very tip of the bow, pointing vertically out of the water like a tombstone. And then, with a grotesque gurgling sound, it slipped beneath the surface. The mighty Hood had vanished. Briggs was alone. Well, not entirely alone. A few yards away, he saw another head bobbing in the muck. It was Midshipman Dundas, and further off, able seaman Tilburn. 3 men, out of a crew of 1,418. 3. The silence that settled over the Denmark Strait was heavier than the gunfire. The battle had moved on. The Prince of Wales, damaged and outgunned, had made smoke and retreated. The Bismarck and the Prince Eugen, their mission accomplished, had steamed on into the mist. The noise of war, the roar of the guns, the scream of the shells, the tearing of steel, was replaced by the sound of water lapping against debris. A wooden crate floated by, a sailor's cap, a piece of cork. Briggs stopped swimming. There was nowhere to swim to. The nearest land was Iceland, hundreds of miles away. The water temperature was near freezing. The oil that coated him was the only thing insulating his body, trapping a meager layer of heat, but it was also poisoning him. He grabbed a piece of wreckage, a small raft that had floated free. He clung to it. His hands were numb. He couldn't feel his fingers. He hooked his arms over the side, locking his muscles. He looked at Dundas. They didn't speak. There were no words for this. To speak would be to acknowledge the reality, and the reality was too big to hold in the mind. They were specks in the wilderness. The Atlantic Ocean stretched out in every direction, indifferent and vast. The sky was still grey. The wind still blew. The sun still tried to break through the clouds. The planet continued to rotate. But the world they knew, the world of the mess deck, the warm tea, the hammocks, the jokes, the officers, the steel walls that had been their home, was gone. It had been erased in 180 seconds. Briggs closed his eyes. The cold began to creep into his core. He felt sleepy. That was the danger. The hypothermia was a seductress. It told you to rest. It told you to let go. It told you that the water wasn't cold anymore, that it was warm like a bath. He forced his eyes open. He looked at the oil slick, shimmering with rainbow colors. He remembered the fire. He remembered the sound of the explosion that he never actually heard. He waited. He did not know if help was coming. He did not know if anyone even knew they were alive. The radio room had been destroyed instantly. Had a signal gone out? Or were they ghosts floating on a grave that had no marker? Minutes turned into an hour. The shock began to wear off, replaced by the agony of the freezing water. The silence was absolute. No birds, no engines, just the slap of water against the raft and the ragged breathing of 3 dying men. This is the crisis. This is the moment where the story stops being about war and starts being about the fragile, stubborn biological urge to exist. Briggs stared at the horizon. He was 19 years old. He had swum through burning oil. He had been dragged to the bottom of the sea and spat back out. And now he had to do the hardest thing of all. He had to wait for the end. Time behaves differently when you are dying. In the normal world, a second is a tick of a clock, a heartbeat, a footstep. In the North Atlantic, immersed in water that is 34 degrees Fahrenheit, a second is a unit of theft. The cold does not just surround you, it invades. It bypasses the skin and goes straight for the blood. It constricts the veins, pulling life away from the fingers and toes, retreating to the fortress of the heart and lungs. Ted Briggs hung on the side of the small cork raft. He was no longer a signalman. He was no longer a sailor in the Royal Navy. He was a biological system shutting down. The shivering, which had been violent at first, a convulsing, teeth-rattling protest of the body, was beginning to fade. This was the danger signal. The body was running out of fuel to burn. The numbness was total. His hands gripping the lifeline of the raft looked like the hands of a mannequin. They were white, stained with black oil, and they did not feel like his own. The silence of the ocean was heavy. It was a silence that felt judgmental. Just an hour ago, this patch of sea had been the loudest place on earth. It had been a cacophony of cordite and steel. Now the only sound was the wet slap of water against the cork and the ragged, shallow breathing of the 3 men, Briggs, Midshipman Dundas, and able seaman Tilburn. They drifted. They did not speak. What was there to say? To speak required energy. To speak required a mind that could formulate a sentence, and their minds were fracturing. Briggs found himself drifting into a strange, dreamlike state. The pain of the cold was being replaced by a drowsy indifference. He looked at the oil slick on the water. It was beautiful, in a grotesque way. It shimmered with iridescence, purples and greens swirling in the black sludge. It smoothed the waves. It was a shroud, laid over the grave of 1,400 men. He thought of his mother. He thought of the tea shop in Redcar. He thought of the warm, smoky interior of the mess deck on the hood. He hallucinated, just for a moment, that he was back there, that the ship was still sailing, that this was all just a nightmare brought on by bad rations. But then the salt water would splash into his mouth, tasting of fuel, and the reality would reassert itself. He was floating in the debris field of the greatest warship in history. He was floating among the ghosts. He began to sing. It wasn't a conscious choice, it was a reflex, a desperate attempt to prove he was still alive. He hummed a tune, something popular and banal, "Roll Out the Barrel." The sound was weak, a croak that barely carried over the wind. But Tilburn joined in, then Dundas, 3 voices, cracking and faint, singing to an empty ocean. It was the only defiance they had left. On the horizon, a shape appeared. At first, Briggs thought it was a trick of the light, or worse, the Bismarck coming back to finish them off. It was grey, angular, slicing through the mist. It grew larger, a bow wave, a funnel. It was a destroyer, the HMS Electra. She had been racing toward the coordinates, pushing her engines to the red line. Her crew was at battle stations, scanning the water for the massive hull of the hood. They expected to find a damaged battleship, perhaps listing, perhaps fighting fires. They expected to see the mighty hood wounded but afloat. Instead, they found a slick of oil that stretched for miles. They found floating packing cases. They found a uniform cap. They found a drawer from a desk. And they found 3 men clinging to a raft. As the Electra slowed, bringing her way off, the silence on her decks was absolute. The sailors lining the rails looked down at the black water. They were seeing the impossible. The hood couldn't be gone. It was like looking for the Tower of London and finding a hole in the ground. The destroyer maneuvered carefully. Scramble nets were thrown over the side. Strong hands reached down. Briggs tried to climb. He told his brain to lift his arm, to grab the rope. But the signal got lost somewhere in his frozen nerves. His body was dead weight. He couldn't move. He felt tears of frustration welling up, hot against his frozen cheeks. He had survived the explosion, survived the sinking, survived the oil, and now he was going to drown 2 feet from rescue because he couldn't lift his hand. But the Navy does not leave its own. Men from the Electra climbed down the nets. They grabbed Briggs by the collar of his oil-soaked tunic. They hauled him up, hand over hand, dead-lifting him out of the grave. He flopped onto the steel deck of the destroyer. He couldn't stand. He lay there, a heap of black sludge and exhaustion. He felt the vibration of the Electra's engines, a different hum, a lighter, faster rhythm than the deep thrum of the hood. They stripped the clothes off him. The oil was everywhere. It was in his hair, in his ears, in his stomach. They scrubbed him with raw cotton waste. They wrapped him in blankets. They poured brandy down his throat, a burning golden fire that shocked his system back into operation. He was carried to the sick bay. The warmth of the ship was painful. As the blood began to flow back into his extremities, it felt like his veins were filled with broken glass. The screaming nerve endings, the doctors called it. It was the agony of resurrection, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological blow that was about to land. An officer from the Electra came into the sick bay. He looked shaken. He held a clipboard. He looked at the 3 survivors, huddled in their blankets, their eyes wide and hollow. "Is there anyone else?" the officer asked. His voice was tight. "Did you see anyone else?" Briggs shook his head. "No, sir." The officer marked something on the paper. He hesitated. "We've been searching for 2 hours. We've quartered the area. There's no one else." The math hit the room like a physical weight. The complement of the HMS Hood was 1,418 men. 1,418, and now there were 3, Briggs, Tilburn, Dundas. That was it. The rest, the vice-admiral, the captain, the cook who made the bad coffee, the boys in the mailroom, the stokers in the dark, the gunners in the turrets, they were all gone. They had been vaporized in the flash or dragged down in the steel tomb. Briggs felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the swallowed oil. It was the sickness of the anomaly. Why him? Why had the physics of the explosion spared him, the boy at the signal flag, while taking the men deep in the armored citadel? Why had the bubble of air shot him to the surface? It felt like a mistake. It felt like theft. The Electra turned her bow toward Iceland. She picked up speed, leaving the oil slick behind. Briggs lay in the bunk, staring at the rivets on the ceiling. He closed his eyes, and instantly he saw the bow of the hood standing vertical in the water. He saw the fire. He heard the silence. He realized then that he would never really leave that patch of water. Part of him would be treading water in the Denmark Strait for the rest of his life. While Briggs lay in the sick bay, a different kind of shockwave was traveling toward England. This one traveled at the speed of light over the wireless waves. Hood sunk. The message arrived at the Admiralty in London, in a cluster of encrypted ciphers. The decoding clerks stared at the strips of paper. They checked them again. They assumed it was an error, a garbled transmission. Hood damaged, surely. Or hood hit. But sunk? It was grammatically and conceptually impossible. But the confirmations came in. The Prince of Wales, battered and retreating, confirmed it. The cruisers confirmed it. The Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was awakened. He was a man who lived by language and history. He understood what the hood meant. Losing a battleship was a tactical blow. Losing the hood was a metaphysical injury to the British soul. It was like seeing the white cliffs of Dover crumble into the sea. But the news had to be released. In a democracy, you cannot hide a disaster of this magnitude. At 9:00 p.m., the BBC interrupted its scheduled programming. The announcer's voice was clipped, professional, burying the emotion under the received pronunciation of the era. The Admiralty regrets to announce the loss of HMS Hood. In living rooms across Britain, the silence that followed was profound. People stopped eating. They stared at the wireless sets. The hood had been the background radiation of their security. She was the monster that kept the other monsters away. If the hood could die, then nothing was safe. If the hood could be snapped in two by a German ship, then the war could be lost. The newspapers the next morning ran black borders. "Hood lost with all hands," some screamed, before the news of the 3 survivors was fully known. It wasn't just grief. It was panic. The myth of British naval supremacy, nurtured since Trafalgar, had been pierced by a single 15-inch shell. The public needed answers. They needed a reason. They needed to know how the unthinkable had become the inevitable. And so the machine turned its gaze on the 3 men who had survived. When Briggs arrived back in Britain, he was not treated as a hero. He was treated as a piece of evidence. He was a black box recorder that had been fished out of the sea. He was taken to the inquiry. It was held in a cold, high-ceilinged room. Men with gold braid on their sleeves, admirals, constructors, engineers, sat behind a long table. They were not cruel, but they were clinical. They were terrified. They needed to know if the design of their ships was fundamentally flawed. They asked Briggs to stand. He was still wearing borrowed clothes. He was still trembling slightly, a tremor that wouldn't go away. "Tell us about the fire," they asked. "Where exactly was it? What color was the smoke?" Briggs closed his eyes. He described the ready-use lockers. He described the orange flames. "And the explosion? Did you feel a shudder before the blast?" They didn't ask him how it felt to watch his friends die. They didn't ask him about the oil or the cold. They asked him about steel plates, about cordite, about flash doors. They were trying to reconstruct the autopsy of the ship through the eyes of a 19-year-old boy. He answered them. He was a good sailor. He did his duty. He told them about the angle of the list. He told them about the final order from the admiral. He gave them the data points they needed to write their reports, to draw their diagrams, to explain away the catastrophe. But inside, Briggs was hollow. He felt a strange distance from the proceedings. These men were talking about a machine. He was remembering a home. They talked about magazine detonation. He remembered the smell of the bacon sandwiches being made in the galley 10 minutes before the end. The inquiry concluded that the hood was lost due to a lucky hit, a golden BB, a 1-in-a-million shot that penetrated the weak deck armor and found the magazine. It was a comforting lie, or at least a partial truth. It allowed the Navy to say, "It wasn't our fault. It was bad luck." But Briggs knew. He had seen the salvos falling. He had seen the precision of the German gunnery. It wasn't luck. It was geometry. The hood had been sent into a knife fight without a shield. After the inquiry, the system did what it does with spare parts. It put him back to work. There was no trauma counseling in 1941. There was no concept of PTSD. If you could stand, if you could salute, you were fit for duty. To dwell on the horror was considered bad form. It was seen as letting down the side. Briggs was assigned to a new ship, the HMS Royal Arthur, and then later to a merchant requisition vessel. Going back to sea was an act of quiet, terrifying bravery. Imagine walking back into the fire that burned you. Every time Briggs stepped onto a deck, he felt the vibration of the engines and his stomach tightened. Every time the general alarm sounded for a drill, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He found himself looking at the water constantly. He measured the distance to the rail. He looked at the lifeboats, calculating how long they would take to launch. He wasn't sailing anymore. He was surviving. One night on patrol, a depth charge was dropped nearby. The dull whoomp of the underwater explosion shook the hull. Briggs froze. The sound transported him instantly back to the Denmark Strait, the smell of the mess deck, the tilt of the floor, the screaming of the metal. He gripped the rail, his knuckles white, waiting for the fire, waiting for the end. But the ship kept sailing. The panic receded, leaving him sweating and ashamed in the dark. He realized then that he was carrying the hood with him. He was a walking reliquary of the disaster. He was the vessel in which the memory of those 1,400 men was stored. He began to have nightmares, not of the explosion, strangely, but of the silence of the 3 men on the raft, the silence of the empty ocean. In his dreams he would be swimming, and he would hear voices calling him from below the water, the voices of his messmates. "Come down, Ted. It's warm down here. Come down." He would wake up gasping, the taste of oil in his mouth. But he never spoke of it. He did his job. He signaled the codes. He hoisted the flags. He wore the uniform. He became a man who was defined by what he had lost. The war ground on. The Bismarck, the ship that had killed his world, was hunted down and sunk just days after the Hood. The British fleet caught her, battered her into a wreck, and sent her to the bottom. It was vengeance of a sort, but it didn't bring anyone back. It just added another 2,000 young men to the inventory of the Atlantic floor. Briggs read the news of the Bismarck's sinking with a flat, cold satisfaction. It didn't fix anything. It just closed the circle. As the years of the war passed, the name Hood began to fade from the daily headlines, replaced by new battles, new disasters, new landings. Singapore, Tobruk, D-Day. The world moved forward, consuming tragedy and metabolizing it into history. But for Ted Briggs, time had snagged on a piece of jagged steel in May 1941. He grew older. He was promoted. He saw other oceans. But he was always, in some fundamental way, that 19-year-old boy, shivering in a coat that was too big, watching the pride of the empire break in two and slide under the waves. He was the witness. And the burden of the witness is that you are never allowed to look away. Peace is a strange thing to a man who has seen the world end. It is too quiet. The urgency evaporates, replaced by the slow, bureaucratic ticking of clocks. When the war finally ended in 1945, the files on the HMS Hood were closed. They were tied with pink ribbon and slid into the dusty shelves of the Admiralty archives. The official story had calcified. The narrative was set in stone, just like a monument. The Hood, the authorities said, had been unlucky. She had been hit by a shell that had defied the odds, a golden shot that had threaded the needle of her defenses. This explanation was comfortable. It protected the reputation of the designers. It protected the morale of the Navy. It suggested that the Hood was perfect and that fate alone was responsible for her destruction. But in the quiet rooms where naval architects gathered, the truth was whispered. They looked at the blueprints of the ships being built to replace her. They looked at the armor schemes, and they knew. The Hood wasn't unlucky. She was vulnerable. She had been sent out to die because there was nothing else to send. The mighty Hood was a tragedy of engineering, a beautiful, fast, lethal mistake that had been covered up by 20 years of propaganda. Ted Briggs knew nothing of the engineering debates. He only knew the memory. He did not leave the Navy. You might think he would. You might think that a man who had been swallowed by the Atlantic would move to the Midlands, as far from the smell of salt water as possible. But the sea is a jealous owner. Once it has you, it rarely lets go. Briggs stayed. He rose through the ranks. He became an officer. He traded the signal flags for a desk and eventually for a commission. His life settled into the rhythm of the post-war world. He married. He had a family. He drove a car. He paid taxes. He lived the life that 1,400 of his shipmates never got to live. But he was marked. In naval circles, he was a celebrity, though he hated the word. He was the survivor. When he walked into a wardroom, conversation would sometimes stall. Young sailors would look at him with a mixture of awe and superstition. They wanted to touch the hem of his garment, to see the man who had cheated the reaper. They wanted to ask him what it was like. And sometimes he would tell them, but he found that language was a poor container for the truth. He could say the words fire and oil and cold, but those words meant different things to men who had never felt their skin freeze or seen the sky turn black with smoke. He realized that he was speaking a dialect that only 2 other men in the world understood. And then there was only him. Bob Tilburn died. Then Bill Dundas. The 3 who had clung to the raft, who had sung "Roll Out the Barrel" in the silence of the Denmark Strait, were reduced to 1. Briggs became the sole custodian of the memory. He was the last living link to the steel cathedral. The weight of it pressed on him. He felt a duty to the dead. He had to keep their names alive. He had to ensure that the Hood was remembered not just as a ship that sank, but as a community of men who lived. Decades passed. The 20th century rushed toward its close. The Cold War came and went. Satellites began to orbit the Earth. The technology of war changed from big guns to guided missiles. The era of the battleship was over, relegated to museums and history books. The Hood became a footnote, a grainy black-and-white photograph in a textbook. But the ocean does not forget. In July 2001, 60 years after the battle, a new ship sailed to the Denmark Strait. It was a research vessel, equipped with side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles, robot submarines designed to go where humans could not. Ted Briggs was on board. He was an old man now, his hair white, his movements slower. He stood on the deck, wrapped in a thick coat, looking out at the same grey, heaving water. The coordinates were punched into the navigation computer. They were looking for a grave. The search was not easy. The Atlantic is deep here, over 9,000 feet down. The pressure is crushing. The darkness is absolute. But the sonar began to paint a picture. It stripped away the water and revealed the sea floor. And there she was. The images that came back from the deep were not of a ship. They were of a crime scene. The violence of the explosion was written in the debris field. The Hood was not in one piece. She had been obliterated. The bow section lay on its side. The iconic sharp nose that had cut through the waves of the Empire now buried in the silt. The stern was miles away, and in between a vast field of twisted metal, shattered plates, and the personal detritus of 1,000 lives. Briggs sat in the control room, watching the monitors. He saw the robot camera glide over the wreckage. He saw the massive 15-inch gun turrets lying upside down, fallen from their barbettes. He saw the conning tower, the place where he had stood that morning. It was a ghost town of barnacles and rust. It is a profound thing to see your own tomb, to look at the place where you were supposed to die. The camera moved closer. It found the ship's bell. The bell is the soul of a ship. It is used to mark the time, to signal the watches. The Hood's bell had been cast with her name and the date. It was lying in the mud, upright, as if waiting to be rung. Briggs stared at the screen. He didn't speak. In that room, surrounded by scientists and camera crews, the silence of 1941 returned. He wasn't looking at rust. He was looking at the morning watch. He was looking at the boys he had messed with. He was looking at the admiral who sat in his chair and refused to leave. The discovery of the wreck changed the story. It confirmed the physics. The rudder was found locked in a turn, confirming that the Hood was trying to present her broadside, trying to unmask her rear guns at the very moment she was hit. The damage to the hull confirmed the magazine detonation. It proved that the end had been instant. The men below hadn't drowned. They had been atomized. For Briggs, It was a closure that had been 60 years in the making. He requested a plaque to be placed on the wreckage, a small memorial made of brass to be left in the dark, 3,000 meters down. He went out to the fantail of the research ship. The wind was blowing. It was always blowing here. He held a wreath of poppies. He leaned over the rail. The water looked exactly the same as it had when he was 19. The sea has no memory. It wipes itself clean with every wave. It is indifferent to our tragedies. It swallows battleships and boys with the same lack of malice. He dropped the wreath. He watched the red flowers bob in the grey swell, drifting away, just as he had drifted away on the raft. "I will never forget you," he whispered. It was a promise he had kept every day of his life. Ted Briggs passed away in 2008. He was 85 years old. With his death, the last living memory of the HMS Hood was extinguished. There is no one left now who can tell you what the coffee tasted like in the mess, or how the deck vibrated at full speed, or what the sky looked like when the Bismarck fired. We are left with the artifacts, the photos, the wreck footage, the history books. But the story of the Hood is not really about a ship. If you strip away the tonnage and the caliber of the guns and the geopolitics of 1941, you are left with something far more elemental. It is a story about the lies we tell ourselves to feel safe. The British Empire told itself that the Hood was invincible because it needed to believe in invincibility. It needed a dragon slayer. So it built a beautiful, flawed machine and called it a god. It is a story about the cruelty of physics. War is not a test of courage, it is a test of engineering. The bravery of the men on the Hood, and they were brave, arguably the bravest of the war, did not matter. Their discipline did not matter. Their love for their country did not matter. When the shell struck the magazine, the outcome was dictated by chemistry and metallurgy. The universe does not grade on a curve for heroism. And finally, it is a story about the burden of survival. We like to think of survivors as lucky. We call them miracles. But listen to the story of Ted Briggs, and you realize that survival is a job. It is a heavy coat that you never get to take off. He had to live for 1,400 men. He had to wake up every morning and justify the air in his lungs. He had to walk through a world that was bright and loud and full of life, while a part of him remained forever in the freezing, oil-choked silence of the Denmark Strait. The wreck of the Hood still lies there in the dark. The currents drift past it. The metal is slowly dissolving, returning to the mineral elements from which it was forged. In a few hundred years it will be gone, eaten by the bacteria and the salt. But for now it remains, a broken cathedral on the floor of the world. If you go there, to that lonely patch of ocean between Iceland and Greenland, you will see nothing but the grey waves rolling under a low sky. The wind will bite your face. The water will look cold and uninviting. But if you listen closely, beneath the sound of the wind, beneath the slap of the water, you might hear the echo of a whistle. The boatswain's pipe, high and clear. Calling the hands to stations. Kind of calling the ghosts home. The sea is silent, but the story is still burning.